Hi, friends. Welcome to day 4. Let's just dig right in. Lord, thank you for your word. God, you're calling us to live in your light and to be a light that now proclaims you, Lord, the excellencies of your name. God, we need your help in that way. Help us to see, help us to learn today how we can live in a way that brings glory to you. Thanks, God. All right, let's read. We're on day 4 on page 88 of the workbook. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. All right, friends, this is not an easy passage. Why? Because this is a culture that is completely foreign to us, thank goodness. I mean, we really do have to we have to take off our 21st century glasses and put on our first century glasses to understand that in the first century, slaves and wives, which that's going to be addressed in the next chapter, were considered human property. Slaves. Not only that, slaves and wives were expected to worship their master or their husband's gods. So, yeah, that's important for us to see and to understand and see that the New Testament writers, the writers of these letters, whether it's Peter, Paul, or James, they actually subvert the cultural expectations by elevating slaves and elevating wives to really what's an unparalleled dignity for first century culture. Now, that being said, we need to understand, remember the rules that I talked about back in the introduction for studying New Testament letters. I said number 1, we need to understand their problem. Number 2, we need to think in paragraphs. What's the point of the paragraph? Number 3, we need to find the lessons that transcend culture. And along with that, I said what belongs in first century culture needs to stay in first century culture. So in no way is the Bible condoning slavery here, okay? Absolutely in no way does it condone slavery. So, in our country, we're still suffering the effects, and many people are suffering the terrible effects of slavery. We're still reckoning with this. So I just want to make that absolutely clear that what was part of first century culture and what Peter is speaking to needs to stay there. But what's very interesting, I think, is that Peter, he addresses slaves, he addresses wives. So, in no way does Peter condone slavery. Just want to make that clear. In fact, it's really interesting. He, along with the other New Testament writers, they address slaves and they address wives directly. This was not the case in Greco-Roman writing in some of the other writings of the first century. They would have been just addressed as really kind of like chattel. But here, Peter addresses them directly, which again, he's he's giving them an unparalleled dignity for this time. And not only that, Peter points to the slave, who is absolutely the most vulnerable person in the first century culture, in the first century society, and he uses them as an example for believers in how to follow Christ. So it's really a beautiful thing. We are all called to live. Peter says we are all called to live as slaves to God. And that was back in verse 16 on yesterday's text. Says, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover up for evil, but living as servants of God. So, that's kind of a side, and definitely we can't learn all of that from the text itself. That comes from looking at some history books and commentaries and maybe a study Bible, and that's why those are useful at times. So, but let's take a look at what we observe directly from the text, and I'll tell you what stands out to me today is that Peter points to Christ as our example. Verse 21, he says, "For to this you have been called," because Christ, okay, maybe I should back up. He says it's a gracious thing in the sight of God if we do good and suffer. All right, that's a gracious thing. And then he uses Christ as our example, Christ who suffered for us. So sometimes what I like to do when I'm studying is make lists of things that I see. And it's very easy to make a list of all the things that Christ did here. So I just numbered them. I actually put that down here in my book. You can see I found a number of things that Christ did. So starting at verse 21, I'll just point those out. Number 1, he suffered for you. For you, Peter says for you. And remember, he's speaking to the scattered church, right? And so this is a plural you, and this we can take this as us too. For you, Christ suffered for you. Number 2, his suffering provides an example for us. Number 3, that we might follow. All right, it's not just an example for us to see, but it's one that we also should follow. And we need to keep in mind, like Peter, remember the first week we saw that Peter left everything and followed Christ. So here we have a similar idea. Here's an example for us to follow. Number 4, Christ, this is verse 20, he committed no sin. He committed no sin. Like, just sit there and let that sink in for a minute. Number 5, neither was deceit found in his mouth. Christ spoke no deceitful words. Again, I could just sit there and let that ponder, let that sink in. What does it mean to never speak a deceitful word? Number 6, when reviled, he did not revile. Or remarkable. That is so unlike our human nature, isn't it? And number 7, when he suffered, he did not threaten. Number 8, he completely entrusted himself to God who judges justly. Number 9, he did all of this and died in his body for us. So here is, wow, friends, this is our example. Peter is using Christ as the ultimate example for suffering for others, for suffering for the purpose of doing good. So a main point that I put, what's the gist of this entire paragraph? I think it's to follow Christ's example in suffering. And we don't like to talk about suffering much. It's mentioned 4 times in these verses. To suffer equates to pain, right? But Peter talks about it quite a bit in this letter. We'll see it again in the next chapter where he says, "For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil." So main point, follow Christ's example. And I think it's worth taking time to maybe just pick out one of those ways for today that I want to follow his example. Here's the one that I wrote down was number 8. Jesus Christ entrusted himself to God who judges justly. So will I entrust myself? Will I entrust my loved ones? Will I entrust you who I know are suffering in various ways too? Will I entrust my loved ones to God? So, friends, I hope that was useful. Tomorrow, let's kind of do a summary. I guess it will be Wednesday. We'll try to summarize all of chapter 2 in our large group teaching time. I look forward to seeing you then.